Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2023 Strickland Symposium. My name is Corey Walker. I currently serve as the Interim Dean of the School of Divinity here at Wake Forest University. I'm also the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities, and I want to thank each and every one of you for attending today, and I'd like to thank our colleagues who are joining us via our Facebook webpage. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself. For this war is for the soul of America. Pat Buchanan's declaration was bracing on the opening night of the 1992 Republican National Convention. In our current moment, it may seem a bit understated in capturing our current political situation. Indeed, what was a call to political revolution in 1992 has become an apt description of an open state of insurrection in 2023. It reminds us that critical and sustained attention must be given to America's long religious war and the fate of American democracy. In a moment when our nation is embroiled in an intense struggle over the substance and very future of democracy in America, it is imperative to understand how and in what ways the languages, practices, rituals, ideas, and institutions of religion have effectively usurped the language of politics. That is, our political conjuncture is not merely a struggle over the good or over the commons, but rather how to enact a politics of God. Scholars and faith leaders have long recognized the political effects of religion, whether the mobilization of religious conservatives in support of a conservative political agenda, or recent calls for progressive religious left alternatives to the political status quo. However, what is needed in our moment, when religious language saturates our politics, is a more critical understanding of how and in what ways religion defines politics as not just about social and political life, but about life itself. Such a task is not merely incidental, but rather fundamental to understanding the substantive transformation of American political culture and indeed of American democracy. The Elizabeth and Robert Strickland Symposium here at Wake Forest University School of Divinity brings distinguished scholars of religion and prominent religious leaders to speak at Wake Forest to engage some of the most pressing issues of religion in public life. This year we continue this tradition with today's symposium exploring the theme, Religion, Pluralism, and the Fate of Democracy. I'm so excited to welcome our distinguished conversational partners for this afternoon. I'll begin with our colleague Ryan Burge. Ryan is Assistant Professor of Political Science as well as the Graduate Coordinator at Eastern Illinois University, where he teaches courses in American institutions, political behavior, and research methods. His research focuses largely on the intersection of religiosity and political behavior, especially in the American context. Previously, he completed an appointment as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute in Carbondale, Illinois, and he has published over 20 articles in a number of well-regarded peer-reviewed journals and is the author of The Nuns, Where They Come From, Who They Are, and Where They Are Going, which is about to come out in its second edition, as well as 20 Myths About Religion and Politics in America. His research has been widely covered in a number of media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Newsweek, Al Jazeera, BBC, and many, many more. He is the co-founder and frequent contributor to Religion in Public and is pastor in the American Baptist Church, having served his current church for over 15 years. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you.
My dear friend, Sabrina Dent. Sabrina Dent directs the BJC's Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, leading several of BJC's educational programs and BJC's project on race and religious freedom. Dr. Dent has served as president of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation when it was an independent organization and joined the BJC staff upon the center's acquisition in 2023. She was a member of the inaugural class of BJC Fellows in 2015 and served on the BJC Board of Directors from 2020 through 2023. A leader in the interfaith community, her public scholarship addresses the complexities of religious freedom, religion and public policy, and race, religion, and American public life. She is author and editor, contributing to the book African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspectives for Congregations and Communities, and her articles have appeared in Religious News Service, Christian Citizen, Freedom Forum, and other outlets. In 2021, Dent was named one of 21 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress, and she co-hosts the Sister Acts podcast produced by the American Muslim Institution. Welcome, Sabrina. Keisha McKenzie is Senior Vice President of Programs and a strategist who interprets communication, religion, spirituality, and politics as social change technologies. From 2018 through 2019, Keisha was Director of Digital Strategy and managed the Groundswell movement organizing community, consulted with other program team members on deepening their impact through Auburn's digital platforms. She also collaborated with the Auburn communications team on public or movement-facing content. Originally from the UK, Keisha completed college in Jamaica and graduate studies in technical communication and rhetoric at Texas Tech University, where she supported the provost office with policy writing and reaffirmation of accreditation, as well as athletic recertification. Her doctoral research addressed the British government's scientific and public communications about weapons of mass destruction in the lead up to the war in Iraq in 2002 to 2003. Through McKenzie Consulting Group, a communications and systems-wide level strategy firm, Keisha has worked on a number of communication and development strategist projects, as well as a faith organizer and consultant. And she has served several faith-rooted justice nonprofit boards across the United States. Her work has appeared in numerous outlets, and she, along with Liz Platt, she is the author of the All Faiths and None Religious Liberty Report and the 2022 Rooted in Resilience Fellow at Faith Matters Network. Keisha served on the board of the Adventist Today Foundation and publishes an e-newsletter called On Tomorrow's Edge. Welcome, Keisha. Our dear friend and longtime partner at BJC is Amanda Tyler. Amanda is Executive Director of the BJC, the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty, leading the organization as it upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by government. She is the lead organizer of BJC's Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign and co-hosts the BJC's podcast, Respecting Religion. Tyler's constitutional law analysis and advocacy for faith freedom for all has been featured in many major news outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, ABC, and CBS News. She also preaches regularly in Baptist churches and at denominational gatherings, and leads sessions on college campuses and community groups of all sizes, advancing the cause of religious freedom for all. Welcome. And lastly, we're excited to welcome one of our Wake Divinity School alums, the Reverend Alan Sherouse. Alan? Let's give Alan a round of applause. Alan has served as senior pastor of First Baptist Greensboro since September 2013. He previously served as pastor of Metro Baptist Church in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood in Manhattan, his first pastorate, where many of his convictions about church, community ministry, social justice, and advocacy were formed. Alan is a graduate of Palm Beach Atlantic University, where he received a BA in religion, and at Wake Forest University Divinity School, where he received his Master of Divinity degree. He also graduated from Vanderbilt University with a Master of Arts degree. Alan is passionate about First Baptist Greensboro's place as a leader in the wider community and devotes time to community and denominational leadership, serving on the boards of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, Wake Forest University School of Divinity, and the Greensboro Faith Leaders Council. In December of 2022, Alan began serving on the Guilford County Board of Education as an elected member of that board. Congratulations, Alan. We also have our Strickland lecturer with us. He will be fully introduced later this afternoon at the Strickland lecture at 4 o'clock in Wake Chapel. But I would be remiss to not only introduce our Strickland lecturer, but also a former Wake Forest colleague and dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Alton B. Pollard. Dr. Pollard is president of Louisville Presbyterian Seminary. He's the 10th president there and began his service in September 2018. He's a noted scholar, author, consultant, and speaker on African American and U.S. religious culture. So we want to also welcome our 2023 Strickland lecturer, the Reverend Dr. Alton Pollard. Today's conversation will proceed as follows. We'll first have opening remarks from each of our conversational partners, beginning alphabetically by last name, so we'll begin with Bob. And after their opening comments, we'll engage in a moderated and curated public conversation on some of the themes that emerge from their opening remarks, as well as some of the themes around this broader, expansive topic around religion, pluralism, and the fate of democracy. So let's begin with Ryan.
Thanks, Corey. And thanks, Wake Div, for doing this. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about democracy and pluralism and religion. I am going to be different than everyone else on the panel because A, I'm a political scientist, and B, I do data. That's the world I live in. We talk a lot about political polarization in political science. You know, the Republicans have become more conservative, the Democrats have become more liberal, and there's no one in the middle of American democracy. Well, I think the unspoken and understudied part of that phenomenon is religious polarization. It's something that we don't talk about enough because I don't think enough people know the full history of America in the last 75 years or so. In the 1950s, about half of all American adults were mainline Protestants. About 50% were part of the Episcopal Church, United Church of Christ, United Methodist Church, ABC USA, what I'm a part of. 50% of America was mainline Protestant. And mainline Protestants basically ran the show. Politically, culturally, socially, politically, they ran the show. Evangelicals were a small part of American culture, really kind of relegated to their own little enclaves in certain spots in America. But by 1972, when we have the best survey data that we can get, about 30% of Americans were mainline Protestant, and about 15% were evangelicals. So between 1975 and 1988, the share of Americans who were mainline Protestant dropped from 31% to 19%. It's a 12-point drop in 13 years. You're talking about tens of millions of people who used to be United Methodists, Episcopalians. I call those religions polite Christianity, right? The ones who won't tell you you're probably wrong, the ones that welcome your neighbor, the ones that just want to help the community, the people who they believe in Jesus, but they're not super fundamentalists about those things. Those kind of churches went from 31% of America to 19% of America in 13 years. At the same time, the share of Americans who were evangelical went from 15% of America in 1972 to 30% of America by 1993. In 1993, there were 75 million evangelicals in America. Today, there are 75 million evangelicals in America. the whole narrative about evangelical decline, I think, is vastly overstated. Evangelicals have a tremendous amount of power in American culture, in American religion, in American society. On an average Sunday in America today, there are 40 million evangelicals in church, and there are 10 million mainline Protestants in church every Sunday. In the 1970s, there were more mainline Protestants in church every Sunday than there were evangelicals. And now for every one mainline Protestant, there are 4 evangelicals in church every Sunday. I don't have to give you all the denominational statistics, but I'll just tell you this. The Episcopal Church, on an average Sunday in America, has 500,000 people in worship across the entire country. 500,000. There are 13 million Southern Baptists, and about half of them go to church every Sunday. So there are 12 times as many Southern Baptists in church as there are Episcopalians. And we haven't even talked about the United Methodist Church and the future they're going to face as they go through the schism. They're 6 million. They were 9 million. Now they're 6. They might be 3 million in the next 20 years because of the split that's going to happen over same-sex marriage, right? If you went to a white American church in the late 1980s, whether it be Catholic, evangelical, or mainline, and you sat in the pew, you were just as likely to sit next to a Republican as you were to sit next to a Democrat. About 40% were Republicans and about 40% were Democrats. If you go to the average evangelical church in America today, white evangelical church, 80% chance you're sitting next to a Republican. So basically you're being surrounded by Republicans on every side. At the same time, the main line has gotten smaller, but it's gotten more concentrated politically and religiously. The people who hang around the Episcopal Church are not people voting for Donald Trump anymore. They just would not be welcome there. So what they're doing is they're leaving. We have echo chambers on the left and echo chambers on the right. And it's happening every Sunday in church. Now, we haven't even talked about the religiously unaffiliated. You know why most of them leave church? Politics. Politics. Because if you go to a church every Sunday that talks about guns and abortion and same-sex marriage and what you don't like, why would you voluntarily go to a place that tells you what you don't want to hear? People like to have congruence. So what are they doing? They're leaving. Right? So what do we have left in American society? I think what we're seeing, the share of Americans who said they were not born again or not nuns in 1988 was 55%. Okay? 55% of Americans said they're not evangelical and they're not nun. You know what that number is today? 35%. 35% of Americans are in the middle of American religion. They don't say they're none, and they don't say they're born-again evangelical. We are losing the middle of American religion. I mean, the death of polite Christianity has really sent shockwaves across American society. Because when you sit next to someone in church, it's really hard to dislike them. Right? When you see their kids, when the grandparents come and bring the grandkids, when you work on boards and committees with them, we call that bridge building. When you build bridges to people who are different than you, you become more tolerant of them, more accepting of them, more open to them, right? But if you're in a church that's 80% Republican, 90% Republican, or 80% Democrat, 90% Democrat, what you do is create the worst version of the other party in your mind and then dislike that version of it. We don't have, and the data backs this up, we don't have friends across the aisle anymore. Most Republicans, their top 5 friends are all Republicans. Most 5 Democrats, their top 5 friends are Democrats. It used to be you would go to church and find Republicans and Democrats and people from different backgrounds, different socioeconomic statuses, and now the church has become one note. From a social science perspective, that grieves me to my core. American democracy works because of pluralism and tolerance. And we build pluralism and tolerance by being in spaces where people are different than us. And what we're losing in American society is what's called the third space. We have home, that's 1. We have work, that's 2. What's the third space? For about 35% of Americans, they don't go to church at all, right? So they have no third. Where are we meeting each other? The VFW, the American Legion, the Elks, the Moose, the bowling leagues, we don't have any of that anymore. So what do? We retreat into our enclaves, religiously and politically, and don't build bridges to people who are different than us. It's hard to move forward as a democracy when we don't see other people as other people. We see them as enemies, combatants in this culture war. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ron. Sabrina.
I'm setting my timer because you told us that we have 6 minutes, and I want to make sure that I honor that time.
Thank you so much.
Yes, so I want to thank Dr. Corey D.B. Walker for the opportunity to be here, as well as Wake Forest Divinity School, and for all of you joining us. And I'm honored honored to be among my colleagues here that are brilliant in the work that they do and very humble in the work that they do as well, as healers of the world. I've entered today's discussion with great caution, concern, and some hope as a Black woman, a mother, a daughter, a sister, an aunt, an interfaith leader, a public scholar, and a religious freedom advocate who often ponders the question, where is my safe space? Ryan just talked about the religious landscape in America that is changing, and I fall in that category for unaffiliated, and I'm a Black woman that does religious freedom work. So that is, I wonder, where is the space where I can fully show up and be myself with the complexities of my identity without experiencing the moral injuries that come with religious privilege in this country? So I want to first ground us in this moment with an excerpt from our book that we wrote. In this essay, I co-wrote with Keisha Patrick called Race, Advocacy, and the Limits of Religious Freedom. And it reads, why do African American perspectives matter when discussing religious freedom? The answers are as simple and complex as recognizing the important voice around the issues involving religion, and as complex as unpacking centuries of bigotry, racism, the legacy of slavery, and what it means to be a citizen in the United States. In 1903, African-American author, civil rights activist, historian, and socialist W.B. Du Bois wrote the words, "The history of the American Negro is a history of strife. This is a longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his or her double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he or she wishes neither the older selves are lost, but they would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He or they would not bleach their Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for they know the Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by their fellows and without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in their face. For me, life, liberty, and happiness looks like a world where every single human being is treated with dignity and respect, no matter what they believe or don't believe or who they love, while ensuring that our laws reflect equality and equity for all people. Doing the work of justice, building community, and expanding religious freedom takes all of us, because the issues of voter suppression, healthcare reform, reproductive freedom, racial justice, LGBTQIA rights, housing, environmental justice, and church-state separation impacts all of us. And yet, the reality is that every person in this country does not experience the fullness of religious freedom nor human freedom. This was made evident just nearly 8 years ago on June 17, 2015, when African American religious communities were once shaken by the tragic events that occurred at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, when a white supremacist, Dylan Roof, took the lives of the 9 church members that were there. They were present, exercising their right to freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, in their house of worship. Their lives were significant to their families and to their communities and loved ones and colleagues. And whereas this event took place in Charleston, South Carolina, the impact of this terrorizing event would not only affect the AME Church, but affect many racial and religious communities around this country. So as I sit here today, the way I lean into this conversation is that looking at this complex history of race and religion in the United States, that we have to remember that is rooted in violence and power, political greed, terror, and white supremacy. That's all birthed in the name of an ideology called Christian nationalism. And so it is important for us to really understand that when I say Christian nationalism, and I know my colleague is going to touch on this, that I'm not talking about Christianity, but a political ideology that seeks to other everyone that doesn't ascribe to that way of thinking about what it means to be Christian or what it means to be American. So I want us to think about, what does that look like when we see public policies in the public square that continue to dehumanize and minimalize the freedoms that we all have in this country. I'll say more during the question and answer period. Thank you.
Ryan and Sabrina have gotten us off to a very, very important start, with Ryan delineating the decline of polite Christianity and what the implications are for American democracy, and Sabrina delineating the different dynamics of religious privilege in the U.S. and what it means for normative ideas of America, normative ideas of what it means to be a democratic society, and more importantly, normative ideas around what it means to be a citizen. Let's continue the conversation with Keisha McKenzie.
Thank you, Dr. Walker, for the kind welcome, and to the Wake Forest community for holding us today. I've been in the U.S. since 2004. I came as an international student. I'm not sure what the ratios of international students on this campus are, but many of them are going to be here. They will spend their student careers intentionally telling the government they are not immigrants. And yet they are working, they are studying, they are contributing to community. And this is part of why, when I think about democracy and belonging and culture, I'm not thinking about it in terms of citizenship. Citizenship in the U.S. has always been framed around those ultimate questions of what it means to be human. Who counts? Who decides? Who's at the table making decisions? Who matters? I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, hearing about religious freedom as a tool that was to be used as a shield, not as a sword, as something that protected minoritized religious communities and people, not as a sword to coerce behaviors from others. And then I came into adulthood as a Black queer woman, somebody who was part of people who had just received civil freedoms in this country in the 1950s and 60s. As a woman, somebody who is currently part of a community that is losing civil rights in this country, sometimes on the basis of religion, and as part of a community that was trying to get civil rights and is struggling to retain them. And so I wondered, in that climate of what Dr. Walker framed as culture war, what Ryan framed as polarization, why it is so easy for us to get trapped into the narratives of antagonism, attack and defense, advance and retrenchment, fighting, defending. We get trapped in these battle metaphors, I call them, presumption of conflict and winners and losers. And I wonder what it would be if perhaps for the first time in this country we might frame our relations with each other not in terms of war and conquest, but in terms of interdependence and mutual flourishing. And I wonder what that would open up for us, and what it would open up for our futures if we assumed that the Muslim and the Sikh person and the Quaker and the humanist and the secular person all had an equal stake at the common table. And I acknowledge, thinking about the country in that way goes against all of our training. I grew up singing Onward Christian Soldiers Marching as to War, and it was a fun song to sing, and it disciplined my mind in a certain direction. And there are other sorts of entailments like that because of the history of the U.S. and religion in this country from the very beginning, from that first encounter of settler colonial explorer against indigenous person. In that very encounter, there's one religion claiming authority over another religion's bodies, cultures, communities, villages, religious practices, civil practices, and political destiny. So saying that, religion in America has a mixed legacy of courage, compassion, but also coercion. And Christians have been disproportionately engaged in decision-making in this country, disproportionately overrepresented in public service. So back in January, the Pew Trust released some research that said that roughly 88% of Christians, 88% of the people involved in public service and federal service are Christian, and Christians only represent 63% of the population. So overrepresented in that role. Jewish people are also slightly overrepresented, 2% of the population, 6% in public service, but everybody else is radically underrepresented. So the people around the table able to make decisions do not represent the people who are in the country receiving the results of the decisions that are made, and that represents us missing a trick or two. We're missing perspectives, we're missing experiences, we're missing perspectives on what it means to hold a life in common together, and to do so not from the perspective of war and conquest, but to do so from the perspective of common benefit and advantage. And so when I think about that, there's an initiative called Inclusive America, which says as America becomes more diverse, so do our best people. Our country and our policies will greatly benefit if everyone has a seat at the table. And researcher Daniel Lawrenson says, currently only a select few get to play. The rest of us are welcome as spectators, but not on the field. And so when I think about framing religious freedom in terms of what benefits people of all faiths and people of no faiths, I'm thinking of religious freedom as neutrally applied to everybody, regardless of their affiliation, non-coercive, not imposing the perspectives of the dominant majority on the minority, non-discriminatory, so that we are free from discrimination in public services, religious freedom as democratic, as supporting people, and as pluralistic and inclusive, representing who we truly are. So Auburn's role in that story is to focus on strengthening, inspiring, resourcing, and connecting leaders who, from whatever their background or vantage point, want to create a future where there is mutual flourishing for all people. And so with resources like these that try to unpack the complicated questions of politics and religious influence in society, we want to enable ordinary people, whether they are clergy or not, to have a positive, constructive influence on the world that we share.
Thank you, Keisha. And we want to hear from our dear friend and colleague, Amanda Tyler.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here. And we really are gathering at this pivotal moment for our people, for our country. And the question is, what will happen with this grand experiment that we are continuing to live into as we seek to create a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious democracy? The question is often raised, are we going to save our democracy? And I think the real question is, are we ever going to really have one? Dean Walker asked us to speak from our area of expertise. So as the leader of the country's only denominationally based organization that is working solely on the issue of religious freedom for all people, I'm going to focus my introductory remarks on how a recommitment to religious freedom for all and a forceful repudiation of white Christian nationalism are both necessary conditions to the ultimate success of our democracy. In the founding document, the U.S. Constitution, we have these foundational values of religious freedom for all. It's a promise that we have yet to fully realize that we are all equal without regard to religion. This promise of a secular government that will remain separate and independent from a thriving religious sector is an arrangement that works best for all in a religiously pluralistic society. Separation of the institutions of church and state protects the freedom of people of all faiths, as well as a growing segment of the country that doesn't claim a specific religious identity. And I call it the promise of religious freedom because I think we have yet to fully achieve that ideal. We've yet to experience full, flourishing religious freedom in this country because we, the people, have never fully dealt with the invasive and deadly poisons that attack equality and freedom. Racism, alongside a political ideology and cultural framework called Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism merges American and Christian identities into one, arguing that real Americans are Christians and that Christianity deserves a privileged place in American law and politics. White Christian nationalism chokes out equality, freedom, and belonging. It creates second-class faiths of anyone who isn't a white Christian. And this exclusionary and divisive narrative is perpetuated by the myth of the United States as a quote-unquote Christian nation, a glorified and fictional accounting of the past that sanctifies the founders and sacralizes the founding documents. The myth transforms political actors into God's agents on earth, carrying out a divine plan for American leadership in the world in preparation for Judgment Day. The founders were not divinely inspired, but they were committed to political freedom from England, including repudiating the English system of state-sponsored religion. The Constitutional Convention then made a deliberate choice not to set up a Christian nation, but rather a secular one. And we have it in the First Amendment: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But because of the persistence and the pervasiveness of the Christian nation narrative and the ideology of white Christian nationalism, there remains to this day a gap between the ideal of religious freedom and reality. There is a gap between who we say we are and who we really are. And if we want to have religious freedom, if we want to keep our democracy alive, if we want to be who we say we are, then we have to work to dismantle white Christian nationalism. James Baldwin wrote, "Not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." And so we cannot undo this history, but we can face it honestly. And so we have to tell the truth about who we are, about what our ancestors have done for some of us, and for others, what our ancestors experienced. And this takes vulnerability, bravery, and openness on everyone's part. It takes a culture that's willing to complicate a narrative that has been propped up by divine sanction to justify all kinds of evil done in God's name. And it means understanding that facing American history honestly is an act of patriotism, not an insult to it. And so it requires us to call out the Christian nation narrative myth for what it is: a lie that perpetuates white supremacy and bigotry. This is going to be hard, but it is necessary. And doing so will give us the opportunity to recommit to these foundational values of religious freedom for all people, that our belonging in American society should never depend on what we believe or how we worship or how we identify religiously, or even if we identify as a religious person at all. And that would make our country truly exceptional. Freedom fighter Fannie Lou Hamer famously said, "Nobody's free until everybody's free." And I'd add, nobody's free until we dismantle white Christian nationalism. It's a poison that's been spreading for centuries, and it won't be easy to neutralize. It's going to take a large, diverse coalition working together for everyone's freedom. And so I'm going to conclude with a plea and a call to action to please join the growing movement of people of all faiths and none who are confronting white Christian nationalism. And together, I think we will finally be able to achieve that ideal of religious freedom, not just for some, but for all.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Along with the ideas around the decline of polite Christianity and the problematics of religious privilege, Keisha and Amanda have placed on our table this afternoon the limits of citizenship as an effective lens and the discursive limits of metaphors of war that owe themselves both to our religious traditions as well as to the discourse of the nation. And what would happen if we change our language and use a discourse of hospitality, a discourse, there we say, of beloved community, to begin to aspire to and to organize our political imaginations. And Amanda really reminded us of the limits of American democracy, both as an experiment and as a practice, and urging us to begin to think more expansively about those founding commitments and how our commitment to an ideology of white Christian nationalism really inhibits us from thinking about a full and flourishing American democracy. So with all of that on the table, all of that before, we're going to bring it to our illustrious alum, the Reverend Alton Sherouse, to bring us home. Alan.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here, to be among such a distinguished panel, and also many thanks to my friend Dean Walker for the invitation, and I should say, as an alum of this school, thanks for your leadership of a school that I love, especially in a critical time. I appreciate you. Well, I am an alum of Wake Divinity, student of religion, a faith leader, serving as a Baptist pastor, and like many of you, a participant and an observer of religion in our public life. And in all of that, I see evidence of what I learned at Wake Forest from Dr. Charles Kimball of the religion department, who reminds us that religion can become evil. Or in the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, religion in and of itself is morally neutral. Tutu goes on to say religion is like a knife. You can use a knife to cut up bread, to make a sandwich, and then a knife is good. But if you use that same knife to harm someone, to hurt someone, then the knife is evil. Religion in and of itself, Archbishop Tutu says, is not good or bad. It's how you wield it. It's what you do with it. Well, among my various roles and identities, most dear to me, beyond those that I have named, is family and the life that I share with my spouse and with our children. And that means that today I did what countless other parents and trusted adults, many of you in this room, did, which is to drop our kids, these children that we love, into a space that we know all over again is so, so vulnerable. I came today directly from a walkathon in my youngest children's school, a school where my first grader recently shared with me about a recent lockdown drill in which she had participated. Dad, she said, we hide near the books because if someone gets in the room, then we can throw books at them. This is a live strategy. We are that desperate. And that echoes in my mind when I hear the recent words of Congressman Tim Burchett from Tennessee. We're not going to do anything, he said, standing on the Capitol steps. I don't think you're going to stop gun violence. And he said that with that sort of bland lament that we recognize. He said it with that kind of implication of impotence, that we're just powerless against this force. But particularly interesting to me was how all of this was rooted in religion. I think you've got to change people's hearts, he went on to say. And as a Christian, as we talk about in the church, I've said this many times, I think we really need a revival in this country. We need a real revival in this country. Let's call on our Christian ministers and our people of faith, said a policy maker, a political leader, an elected official, as though revival, which means religious conversion, conformity to a certain prescribed set of beliefs, as though that is our solution. As though Christianity is the exasperated last and only hope against atrocious violence. As though the way we protect those vulnerable, our children, is through some sort of religious uniformity. Religion is like a knife, or sometimes something even more violent and destructive than that. And that's what I find so vital about the interplay between the three qualities that we have named in this symposium: religion, pluralism, and democracy. Because pluralism, acts as a mediator for religious freedom. It ensures that we respect diversity, it values it, it celebrates it because of the recognized benefits that it has to society. And then democracy At its best, it protects and ensures pluralism. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all of the others that have been tried. And one aspect of democracy is that it is a system that is suited to secure and sustain pluralism in today's world. It can enshrine rights and liberties and make sure that everyone has these in our institutions, regardless of race, gender, sexual identity, or religion. It gives everyone a voice. And so I think we can understand an attack on democracy at base as a disdain for diversity. We recognize this especially in white Christian nationalism, the privileging of a certain way of being American. And it targets our most foundational institutions. Of course it does. It targets elections, for instance, or elsewhere in my life and work. It targets our schools, our public schools. I was recently elected to the Guilford County Board of Education, and I first pursued this seat because I observed what many of you did, and that is the ratcheting up of intensity in the conversation surrounding our schools, the intensification of the rhetoric, and the targeted, oh so well-funded and completely strategic effort to erode trust in these essential institutions. And of course, they targeted the schools because schools are a laboratory for our highest democratic ideals. They are a chance to say that what I want for my 4 children is a guarantee to all of our children: equity, flourishing, thriving, and safety. And so a threat to that is perhaps the most basic threat that can be made against our democracy. It is an attack on pluralism, and it does have a religious underpinning. And so we stand against that in the places where we have influence. We ensure equity, we work for the common good, we protect the rights of all people, and we give everyone a voice. And I want to say, to the degree I'm able to do any of that, it is not in spite of the fact that I am Christian, or that I attempt to follow in the way of Jesus of Nazareth, or even that I'm a Baptist minister, but it is as the most compelling, responsible, healthy, faithful outgrowth of those religious convictions.
Thank you so much. We've had a number of very broad and big ideas placed on the table, and what I want to do is to allow our Strickland lecturer a brief moment if he has some thoughts inspired by these particular presentations, and then we'll engage in a bit of moderated conversation. So, Professor Pollard.
Thank you, Dean. Good to see everybody. It's good to see everybody, and it's good to be with you. It's powerful to hear our panelists to be a part of their presentation. I was just dining off of the wisdom that is here, not expecting to speak, but glad to be a part of this conversation. But I want to know, some of you may have heard, as we were coming over, Jessica and I, this morning to the campus, we heard the news about the active shooter presence on the campus of Forsyth Tech. And we heard that the event took place in the Robert L. Strickland Center. And I was struck by that. And I said to Jessica, I wonder if that's the same Robert Strickland that is it the same?
Yes, and I would like to let everyone know that that shooting incident is not an active shooting incident, and we've sent out new messages around that, both here as well as in Winston-Salem Public Schools. But it underscores, it goes to your point.
Yes.
But I want to make sure everyone is aware of that.
Because I was going to ask if there was an update, so it's good to hear that.
That's why
that was
have the phone.
the update. And it is a critically important update, consistent with what Alan just talked about with his children, that whether talking about public schools or higher education or houses of worship or movie theaters, it doesn't matter. We have turned our society into a place where incivilities are at the height of our discourse, and it goes right back to the root of the founding of our nation, we do not, I think, Keisha, Sabrina, I'm sorry, Keisha, Sabrina, see, I'm going to get it one day. One day, Sabrina talked about, was it you that talked about the violence of our nation? Yes. Born in violence, begets violence, continues violence, reaps violence. There's an old expression, a doggone man knows no master, only the taste of blood. Once you have set that in motion as the beginning of your identity, it is then exceptionally difficult to have to wrestle with that in the framework of a constitution and later a declaration of independence that will hopefully establish a set of sacred templates that will forge the identity of the nation. They are in utter contradiction to each other. And right now, as from the very beginning, white Christian nationalism, as has been said, has been winning the public, and I emphasize public, debate. But death has never had the last word for people of faith. It has never had the last word for people who believe in the democratic impulse, and it will not have the last word here. I could say a lot more, but since I'm going to talk so much this afternoon,
So I want to pick up on this, and this tension runs through. It's the tension that Ryan opened up with. It's this tension of political polarization and its deepening effects on our democratic culture, and the aspirations the aspirations and reality of a pluralist America. In many ways, these two realities are in conflict. How do we begin to not only undo that conflict, but what are some of the resources that we have available now to begin to respond to that deep and ongoing issue that we're confronting? And Ryan, I'm sure you have some data for us on our deepening political polarization, because it is a major topic in our public discourse.
Yeah, one thing I didn't talk about to begin with, I want to talk about now, is the difference between white religion and non-white religion in this country. And I think that's something that, like, I came from a white Southern Baptist background in a small town, 8,000 people. I had no non-white friends, so I went to college. So that flavors my perspective. But I've been doing a lot more work recently about white religion versus non-white religion. If you look at religious attendance and voting patterns, for white people, it's the most dramatic difference you could ever imagine. For those who attend more than once a week, about 75% voted for Donald Trump in 2020. Amongst those who attend never, it's about 33% voted for Donald Trump. Right? So it's a clear gradation on the white side. On the non-white side, you know what the difference is? There is no difference. Right? So it's the mix between religion and race that we have to think about more. Why is it that white Christianity, especially fervent white Christianity, right? So, and by the way, when I say that, don't just think Southern Baptists and like non-denominational Assemblies of God, people like that. Even in the United Methodist Church, a majority of United Methodists voted for Donald Trump in 2020. Okay? Even the main line, which people always say the liberal main line, listen, the ELCA, the average ELCA is right of center. Okay? So we've got to be very careful. There is, for white people, if you're going to be a Christian, you're almost always going to have to go to a conservative church now. In almost every part of America. I know we're in a place where there's lots of different options. My option, 40,000 people in Jefferson County, Illinois, 40,000 people in the county. There are a total right now of 4 mainline churches in my entire county. Mine had 8 people in it. Okay? ABC USA. The ELCA and the PCUSA to join together into one building because they couldn't afford their own buildings anymore, have 30 people or less. Wow. The Episcopals don't meet anymore because they can't find a priest. And the United Methodist Church, well, they're going to split. So in 5 or 10 years, there might be one mainline church in a county of 40,000 people in rural Illinois. So if you're going to be a white liberal Christian in rural America, what is your choice? Your choice is to be a nun. Like that's your functional choice because you have no outlet to express your belief in Jesus Christ. And I think we have to think about that from the white perspective a little bit, right? Like, there are some white, sympathetic, liberal-ish Christians in rural America, and they're being pushed out of church because they have no option for church. You know, it's easy when you grow up in an urban area to think, oh, you've got options. You do not have options. If I'm a gay man and wanted to marry my husband, my future husband, there's not a single church in my county that would do that wedding right now. Think about that. Not a single one. Mine included, by the way. Not my choice, but my congregation's choice. But not a single one would do that. So we have to think about, like, the racial divide is important here, but the rural-urban divide is just as important as well when we're talking about white Christian nationalism. I think hey, social science, things are complicated, right?
Thanks so much, Alan. Anyone else want to dive in for that? Amanda, you're seeing this across the nation, and you're with BJC's work. BJC historically has had a strong presence in D.C., but now BJC is doing work on the ground, organizing. What are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, I was really reflecting about this polarization issue, and I'm intrigued. I think that I agree generally that it's somewhat polarized and that we are sorting religiously and politically. I think that there is some nuance there, and I am in a number of churches that are still politically mixed, you know, and that pastors are struggling how to preach social justice into that space, and how not to alienate, and how to keep a community, a politically diverse community, together. But I think there's a bit of the tail wagging the dog here, because why are people organizing into these spaces? What are they worshiping in these spaces? Are they practicing Christianity, or are they practicing white Christian nationalism? There's a new poll out just earlier this year from the Brookings Institution and PRRI, and there was a really startling statistic. The poll is all about Christian nationalism and how it's showing up in different communities. But in one of the questions, they looked at church attendance, and it says that the more you go to church, the more likely you are to be a Christian nationalist. The more likely that you are to ascribe to the Christian nationalism ideology. You may or may not be surprised by this. It was very startling to me because of this issue that Dr. Dent raised earlier, that Christian nationalism is not the teaching of Christ. This is not what the gospel says. It takes the gospel of love and turns it into a false idol of power. And so I think it raises the question for all of us is what exactly is happening in our churches. If people are being converted into Christian nationalism the more they go to church, then what exactly is happening in the churches? And so I think that, I don't know that that's a solution, but I think the solution is to return more to the teachings of Christ and to not be so aligned with a political party, either political party, and to try to get away from that control of the church. And then, you know, to the question of, well, what can unite us? How can we overcome this polarization? And, you know, what unites us, or could unite us, is our patriotism, is our commitment to the American experiment, which is to this experiment in pluralism that's flourishing through democracy. And so I think when we are combating Christian nationalism, I think it's very important for us to do so as a patriotic value, as something that recognizes that white Christian nationalism is fundamentally anti-democratic, and that it is a patriotic impulse to call out the lies of the Christian nation and to wish for a better way.
On this idea of continuing this polarization and pluralism, we have two other perspectives that engage us at a very foundational level. The experiment, the idea that is put on the table by Keisha around how we understand American democracy from an immigrant experience and the very limitations of our political categories and the need to develop a more expansive framework. And the idea that Sabrina placed on the table around interfaith. What happens when the Christian supremacy of our nation outstrips the deep religious pluralism and diversity that can inform us? How do we begin to think through pluralism, and the politics of polarization from those perspectives. The perspective in and around immigration and the perspectives in and around interfaith. Keisha and then Sabrina.
I have to start by thinking about religion outside of the context of congregational experience. Like, religious institutions are only one facet of religion in the country. So religious people are also a significant factor in the experience that you have with religion in America. And so when Ryan's talking about the decline of third spaces, and we're all talking about people withdrawing from religious congregations, Christian largely, but sometimes also in other religions as well, where are people learning how to form relationship with one another? Where are people learning how to tell stories about the things that we hold in common? And myth is sometimes used as a proxy for a lie, but actually a myth is a very, very true thing. It's a true way of talking about ultimate reality and meaning using symbols and metaphors and heroes and stories, and providing people a way to understand and organize their experience together, not just as an individual, but in collective communities. Myths are how you form culture. So if we're losing community spaces, and the congregational spaces that remain are largely radicalizing spaces, then we need, outside of religious institutions or outside of the congregational space, community spaces where people are learning how to tell new stories of connection, new stories of care and kindness, new stories of mutual responsibility and accountability, and practicing, sometimes through interpersonal conflict and political disagreement, how to transcend their differences and take the best from their differences to serve the group. So it's kind of like taking the country, the entire country, at the level of the person and at the level of community, back to kindergarten, to learn how to share the crayons and the toys in a sandbox. Because if the foundational experience and training, and all of our disciplinary training through schools and congregations and politics, has been to fracture us and polarize us, we need to go back to kindergarten.
Well, Dr. Keisha. I want to touch on this point here. First of all, in mentioning that there are communities outside of traditional brick and mortar spaces that people fellowship, I was glad to see Dr. Melva Sampson step into this space because of the work and the community that she has built with Pink Rope Chronicles that has allowed some of us to have space where we will not enter into buildings that will not receive us in our wholeness. And I think it's important for us to recognize that in speaking to the interfaith piece of it, Corey, is that I agree that it is this building of community outside of what people might perceive should be the norm. I have found safety in the community of my interfaith friends because of where we find common ground. And for me, that comes from a place of human dignity. The concern for me is what Dr. Keisha raised in the data around, like, who makes the laws, right? Who makes the laws in this country? When Christian normativity is baked into how laws are made in this country, it immediately dismisses those who don't subscribe or live by those codes of living or beliefs, whatever we want to call it. And so then it immediately excludes the concerns and the needs of those people. So how do we, who may identify as the majority, right, or because of how we may show up in the world as allies, then push back on the ways in which laws and policies are constructed that considers everyone else an other? And for me, that's moving from us having these conversations about education and information to then mobilizing people to take action. And it's not until then, because we could sit in symposiums all day, which are wonderful, but if we're not moving people to a place where they're really taking action, you are a great example. The fact that you moved from talking about something to actually moving to the school board to say, hey, this is an issue that I see. I think that's one of the ways, right? In the communities that we're in, where do we see the problems and the gaps in how communities are being served? Again, going back to how Christian normativity is baked into society, even in thinking about public schools, right? If you look at the school calendar, who gets to take time off without being penalized for their religious beliefs or their worldviews? That is something significant to the child as well as to their family. So my thing is, it's about us moving to action. One of the things I'm grateful for is that with the BJC, like we are, and through the BJC Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, we're committed to really walking the walk of what we say we believe. Right? The center started, and we have this phrase that we say that faith is our foundation, justice is our calling, and reconciliation is our goal. In meeting that goal of protecting faith freedom for all. When we're saying for all, it means for all. And that's the thing, is that we have to be intentional about educating ourselves about these issues, but then also paying attention to what is happening in society. But I also recognize that some of our lives are very busy, and so we look over things that we might be like, oh, well, that really won't have impact in my area, right? But I want to make it clear. If you look at public policies that are coming out right now around issues of, I'm going to use down in Florida, it happened in Virginia too, with HB 787, which was a particular policy that was targeting how teachers should teach about history in public schools. And so people may have seen this as just a black and white thing, and no, it's not. Because when you're thinking about history in this country, you have to think about who was impacted by any particular moment in time, and how has that continued to have impact on those communities today. We can talk about the indigenous community. We can talk about Japanese internment camps. But if you're saying to educators they cannot talk about certain things, and yet there are groups fighting for their civil and human rights today, we got there for a reason. So you can't overlook history. So it's about having resources. And one of the things as far as indigenous communities is that BJC has shown a commitment to making sure we're protecting faith freedom for all by our Safe Oak Flat campaign, which is not just about indigenous lands, but the sacred indigenous lands. And as one of our colleagues has been pushing us even further to say, this is also about economic justice. Because these communities are now reliant on other communities to financially support them, to save the spaces that are so sacred to them. And this is a religious freedom issue. So again, going back to when we're talking about Christian nationalism, if you have an ideology that suggests what it means to look like in this country, what it means to show up, who has the right to believe and to practice, then what does that mean for everyone else? So there are resources out there like BJC where we're doing the work, but also just look at what's happening in your community and look at the individual, the groups in your community that are speaking out. Last thing I'll say is that as someone, I have the privilege of living in Arlington County, Virginia, and I say privilege because the school district has a nice, robust budget. And you recognize in other places that is not the case. Just last week, Amanda, was it the piece of legislation that went to the floor where they tried to take public school money from already low-income areas? So when you're, again, trying to decide that money, you're going to say, I'm going to take public money and allow them private religious education, which has an agenda, because they're not just teaching ABCs, right? They're teaching their theologies and their beliefs. To take that money and put it towards religious education and not public education, where you come from disadvantaged areas and a policy like that is in effect, what happens to those children that are already in those disadvantaged communities? So for us, it's about reimagining religious freedom and how this shows up in many different ways and have impacts in communities, not just how it may have looked to everyone on January 6th.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Alan, I want to wrap up this segment of our conversation by going to you because you're straddling two of these formation communities, congregation at First Baptist Greensboro, as well as how you beautifully and elegantly described it, these laboratories of democracy called our public schools. How do we navigate and negotiate some of those competing commitments in order to build a robust commons where we can all go and engage and in developing a broad pluralist democracy in America?
You know, I don't necessarily want to be polarized, but I do want to be clear. And I think too often we hide behind unity and end up sacrificing moral and ethical clarity. So I'm not trying to put a pole in the ground and say, you stay over there, but I am trying to say I'm clear about these convictions that are going to govern my life and my work. Will Campbell is someone who comes to mind and someone that has inspired me, whom I came across in college and learned more about when I was at Wake Forest because of some of the work he did contemporary to Ed Christman and James Dunn, and certainly Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Will Campbell was a self-proclaimed bootleg preacher, meaning he was not bound to institutional life, and he would let it rip. And so he was standing in the Riverside Church, invited there by William Sloane Coffin, and he started his sermon and he said, "Bill tells me that y'all want to hear about following Jesus, but y'all don't want to hear about that." And he looked at the nave and all of the stained glass and everything ornate and adorned in the sanctuary. He said, "Y'all want to hear about how to follow Jesus and keep all of this." And I think we have to admit how often that governs what we're willing to say, and how often the commitment to the institution and the unity, the strategy of unity necessary to sustain that ends up costing us a sense of moral and ethical clarity. I can say that my primary denominational partner is the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and as recently as last week celebrated this ideal of being purple. But again, I feel like when we do that without a clarity about the things that matter most, how far do we want to reach when it comes to children's lives? How far do we want to reach when it comes to the rights of all people? I don't want to be that unified if it compromises core conviction. And it recalled for me a time in 2016 when a trusted church member said, I hear people saying purple church, but I'm concerned that we end up being a yellow church, meaning a scared church.
All right. We have a few more moments for this conversation, and there's been a lot put out. And what we want to do now is open up the opportunity to engage some of your questions. I know we're in an audience where there are a lot of ministers, but we want to make sure we keep them to a bit of questions right now. We will have a lot of time for conversation throughout the day, throughout this day, particularly with our Strickland lecturer. So we have a few more moments for a couple of questions, and I see Maggie. Maggie has the first question.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you all so much for your time and for your insights, particularly coming from the different areas of expertise that you all have. Very much appreciate your time. I'm really interested in this idea of the dwindling third space, as well as, I believe, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on your name, I apologize. Sabrina, you were mentioning in the idea of having interfaith spaces, as well as Dr. Keisha, I think you were mentioning outside of what's happening outside of the congregation or outside of those spaces. And I'm curious myself and a couple of colleagues, we've had this conversation of how to have secular spaces and spiritual spaces. And those being the spaces, whether they're united around common interests, whether it's a knitting club or a book club, or the spaces where what's drawing people together is people from all different walks of life just because of a shared interest, and using those spaces as that, either the third space or the space in which to create those as intentionally spiritual or intentionally the space to have these conversations, and how one can use those spaces to meet people from different walks of life and have, as you said, like, we can't other if they're right in front of us, and actually interacting and having conversations and seeing people as human beings. I'm curious as to the role of those secular spaces playing in that sort of mediation point of becoming the new third space, as well as if anyone has an experience speaking to the role of sort of virtual spaces becoming that space. And I'm also kind of thinking, I mean, there are like Instagram, TikTok, those which also have their own echo chambers, but virtual spaces like Zoom communities or Zoom small groups where my primary spiritual is happening, and I see you in your smiles of the work that you're doing as well, Dr. Sampson. In those spaces being the spaces where we're meeting people from different walks of life. My primary spiritual community is the Harry Potter Sacred Text community. And so those are where we have all the conversations, and some are nuns, some are like Christians that are no longer Christians, some are pagan, and so that's where those conversations are happening for me, but it was intentionally not a religious space or a spiritual space, but we made it that.
I think you made it that because that's what humans do. So humans are looking for space for connection, for meaning, for exploring, for getting different perspectives, for experiencing insight and discernment, and that's just what humans will do when we gather. It naturally happens. And I love both your pointing out virtual spaces, which are just as robust and meaningful as in-flesh spaces, and sometimes bridge the two. So at Auburn, we often talk about people of faith and moral courage, to acknowledge the moral courage and ethical questioning that people outside of formal religious affiliation do naturally. One of our partners, Women's March, did a survey a couple of years ago asking their list of millions of people who are concerned about justice and the gender rights in the country. Are they religious, or do they have a spiritual root of any kind? And like 55% of them said they do. But you wouldn't have expected that because in their public narrative, it's largely about legislation and politics. So I think we underestimate how many people have deep spiritual cores, but don't necessarily use the language of religion to couch it. But I think it is increasingly important that, as Ryan was saying, and Sabrina, in a different sense, the way that the economy is structured, you cannot really hardly live on one income alone. And so if you're in a household where you have dependents, you're going to be working more than 40 hours naturally, which means you have less time after you come off work exhausted to go to the knitting club. So we need to have a query about how much space work has subsumed in people's lives that makes it difficult to form connections with our neighbors. Do we even know who our neighbors are anymore? That's another question. And so where we have those opportunities for people to form relationships around mutual interests and common concerns, it's a practice space. It becomes, as Alan was saying, a laboratory for us to learn again what it means to be human, to think beyond ourselves, to touch something transcendent and become formed by it.
Thank you so much. We have about 5 minutes left, and what I want to do is offer us a parting word to pause the conversation at this moment, to continue it in other moments, not only this day, but every day. But we have assembled a wonderful group of conversational partners, and I want to thank each of them for what they've said, and more importantly, embody in their work. So I want to thank each of them. And also, I want to give each of them 1 minute to provide us with a remark to continue the conversation. How do we continue this important conversation in the many spaces that we inhabit every day? And I'll start with Ryan, and then we'll continue on.
So I did this NBC News documentary about religion. The reporter came to our church and videoed our church, and then she went to something called Sunday Assembly, which is an atheist gathering, religious gathering happens every Sunday. We sang hymns, they sang pop songs. I gave a sermon, they gave a talk, an inspirational talk. If you follow Sunday Assembly, it's a fascinating story. They blew up. I mean, there were hundreds of them across America, and now there are very few of them across America. And the reason they were is because they were afraid to ask their people for money, because it had such a religious connotation. You know, religion evolved and changed and still persists because it figured out how to do those things. It figured out how to be persistent. You can't do one part of it and then not do the other part of it. You need money to pay for speakers and space and music. I, as a social scientist, would love if atheists gathered all over America every weekend and did stuff together. I want anyone to do that. It's just, I think using the structure of religion without the religion part might actually be a good way forward, right? But you can't cut off one leg of the stool and hope the stool still stands. There's a reason that churches have existed for 2,000 years, and they're going to exist in 1,000 years. It's because the structure works. Right? And these other communities are great. They just need to think about what long-term sustainability looks like from a structural perspective.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And we get Sabrina?
What I would like to leave you with is in your daily engagement of the people that you say you love and that you care for, think about the issues that impact those people. Not on a superficial level, but on a deeper level. At the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, I am honored to work with scholars and faith leaders and organizers who are committed to live in their faith to advance justice issues so we can build a more sustainable community. But what does that look like on a deeper level? For me, it's always thinking about the commitment that I made as I pursued my doctoral work. And I had the privilege of having the late Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon as my instructor. And she always told us to do the work that our soul must have. And so I think about my thesis statement in my DMin work that reminds me when I said that, and I had a healthy critique of interfaith spaces. And my thesis was that in interfaith spaces, we like to recognize people for their differences. I'm paraphrasing it. You can look it up and Google it because it is published. But I basically said that we like to be inclusive, but not consider really what does it mean for the whole person to come in that space. And if we cease to do that, if we're not being fully inclusive, then we are hypocrites of the very missions that we profess and need to cease to exist. So my thing is, do the work that your soul must have, but also think about the people that you say you love and that you care for. And if you really love and care for them, then do the work to make sure that they can live, thrive, and exist in society without discrimination or barriers for their being.
Keisha.
I want to invoke Auburn's president, the Reverend Dr. Emma Jordan Simpson. She spoke recently at a conference on mass incarceration in Atlanta, and she said during her remarks that every miracle that God ever performed requires our active participation. And so when I talked earlier about mutual flourishing being a promise and vision of this country that has not yet been fully realized, I only say that as recognition that there is work for us yet to do. And that vision, realizing that vision requires our active participation. It also requires extraordinary and consistent vigilance. So we are 20 years out from the Iraq War, which Corey mentioned I worked on in my dissertation. And I think about that as a season that reminded us truth still matters. And we should be thinking not only about the people who are making decisions, but also the people who those decisions affect. And secondly, we should also be thinking about the actions that we put into place or the policies that we put into place have down-chain consequences for people outside of the intended audience. We set in motion a surveillance culture 25, 30 years ago. And that it began with the non-immigrants, and it affects every citizen now. You give your 10 prints, you give your irises when you come back into your own country. But that was set in motion 30 years ago. So if we are vigilant today, if we are anchored in this vision of mutual flourishing today, with consciousness that what we do today affects not only us, but people who are unlike us, that we might not be understanding how these decisions and policies shape them, but we can start to listen. And we can invite them to tell us their stories, and we can choose to be shaped by that.
Amanda?
So I love Symposia because so many new ideas come together, and so just trying to find a little synthesis here. I love that quote about our active participation. I don't get to preach every Sunday, but I did this past Sunday out of the lectionary of Ezekiel 37 and how we bring new life to dry bones, with the dry bones being American Christianity. This sense that we're dead and we don't even know it, but that requires our active participation with prophecy, with speaking truth to power, with protest, with recognizing that ideology is killing us and speaking reality to that, but also with the divine intervention of the breath. And so remembering that God is always with us, breathing God's Spirit into us and giving us the moral courage to speak truth to power. And I'm thinking in just a seed of conversation about this third space and thinking about the work that we're leading at BJC at Christians Against Christian Nationalism of trying to create a third space of activists, not just Christians, but people of all faiths and none, who can come together with the resources we're providing and come across different lines of theological and ideological and political difference to stand up against Christian nationalism and stand for religious freedom for all. And we were in Dallas last week with an organizing meeting of our very first pilot local organizing project of Christians Against Christian Nationalism, doing exactly what we were talking about here today. Building a community, building relationships, learning from each other about how Christian nationalism is harming our communities, and coming up with strategies to do something about it.
And Al.
Bring it home. Well, I quoted him already, referenced him already, and so I will close with words that I learned from Reverend William Sloan Coffin of Riverside Church, who used to say to his congregation at the close of every service, what we may need to hear in a world where we worry for our children and where we work against so much that is targeted and monstrous and well-funded, and where trust erodes in so many of the things that we need. May God give you grace, never to sell yourselves short, and grace to risk something big for something good, and grace to remember that the world is far too dangerous now for anything but truth. It is far too fractured for anything but love, and it is far too cynical for anything but hope.
And on that note, we want to thank each of you for joining us this afternoon.